in Babylon, in June of the year 323 BC. The most powerful generals in the world stood around a single bed. The man lying on it was 32 years old. He had conquered everything from Greece to India in 13 years, and he was dying without an obvious successor, without anyone capable of holding together what he had built. According to one ancient tradition, when he was asked who should inherit the empire, Alexander whispered only this: "To the strongest." In that room stood a simple officer. Almost nobody was watching. Not the richest man there, not the most powerful. His name was Seleucus. 40 years later, he would rule most of what Alexander had conquered, an empire stretching from the Aegean Sea to the mountains of the Hindu Kush, and his family would hold it, lose it, win it back, and finally strangle it with their own hands. Across 2.5 centuries, Alexander built his empire in 13 years. Tonight is the story of the 260 years that came after. Let the room grow quiet. We begin in Babylon. Chapter 1. An empire without an heir. Start with the size of the problem. By the summer of 323 BC, one man held personal authority over roughly 2 million square miles of the earth: Macedonia and Greece in the west, Egypt in the south, the entire Persian Empire, which had taken 2 centuries to build, in the middle, and beyond it, territory reaching to the Indus River Valley, at the edge of what any Greek map even attempted to describe. Now, this empire was not simply one man and his soldiers. Beneath Alexander, there was a real administrative machine, much of it inherited from the Persians he had conquered. Satraps governed provinces. Taxes were assessed and collected. Roads were maintained. Records kept. Garrisons paid. The Persian kings had spent 2 centuries building that machinery, and Alexander had largely kept it running under new management. What did not exist was any accepted answer to a single question. When Alexander is gone, who commands all of this? There was no law of succession, the whole empire recognized. No institution with the authority to choose. The machine had 1,000 working parts and no agreed way to replace the driver, which means that when Alexander began dying in Babylon that June, the question in the palace was not simply who will rule. The question was whether anyone could rule, whether the parts would hold together at all without the one man every part answered to. The ancient sources describe his final illness in unusual detail. The historian Appian, writing more than 4 centuries later, but working from accounts left by men who were in Babylon, tells us that Alexander developed a fever after a night of heavy drinking, that the fever worsened over roughly 10 days, and that near the end he could no longer speak. Plutarch preserves a similar picture. The army, refusing to believe their king was dying, demanded to see him. So, the veterans filed through the room in a single line. Un by un. And Appian says, Alexander could do nothing but move his eyes and lift his head slightly as each man passed. Picture that scene for a moment. These were soldiers who had walked from Greece to India and back. Many had served under Alexander's father before him. They had crossed the Hindu Kush in snow and the Gadrosian desert in heat that killed thousands. And their king, the reason all of it had happened, could no longer say a single word to them. What actually killed him is a question historians still debate. Typhoid fever, malaria, and the cumulative damage of old wounds and heavy drinking have all been proposed. Some ancient writers claimed poison, and some modern researchers have explored that possibility. But there is no scholarly consensus, and honesty requires saying so plainly. What matters for our story is not the cause of death. It is what he failed to leave behind. Alexander had no adult son. His wife Roxana was pregnant, but no one knew if the child would be a boy, or survive infancy, or ever be accepted by Macedonian soldiers. Because Roxana was not Macedonian, she was from Bactria, in what is now Afghanistan. There was also Alexander's half-brother, a grown man named Aridaeus. But the sources tell us he had a mental impairment of some kind and had never been considered capable of ruling in his own right. That was the entire list. An unborn child, and a man the army would crown but could never follow. And so we come to the most famous deathbed moment in ancient history, according to a tradition preserved by several ancient writers. When Alexander was asked to whom he left his kingdom, he answered with a single phrase, "To the strongest." Some sources add a darker line, that he foresaw a great funeral contest over his body. Did he actually say it? Here, an honest telling has to slow down. Appian reports the story, but signals caution about it. Other accounts say Alexander was beyond speech, entirely in his final days, which would make the, quote, impossible. It may be genuine. It may be a legend invented afterward, because it explains so perfectly what happened next. We cannot know. What we can know is that whether or not he said it, the empire behaved exactly as if he had. Because, within days of his death, before his body was even embalmed, his generals were negotiating over the corpse. Within weeks, the arrangement they made was already cracking. Within 2 years, they were killing each other. For the record, the generals did begin with the forms of loyalty. They crowned the unborn child and the half-brother as joint kings. And for a while, every ambitious man claimed to act in the name of the royal house. But a crown worn by an infant and a crown worn by a man who could not command are crowns held by whoever stands behind the throne. And everyone understood it. The kings became pieces on the board rather than players. The wars that followed would eventually consume Alexander's mother, his widow, his son, his half-brother, and almost every surviving claimant of his house. Most of them killed in the maneuvering of men who had sworn to protect them. Alexander was, by almost any measure, one of the most capable individuals who ever lived. Undefeated in battle, a master of logistics, of propaganda, of political theatre. And yet he made no serious arrangement for what would happen after him. He named no regent with clear authority. He built no mechanism that could outlive his own heartbeat. Every system built around one irreplaceable person carries the same hidden expiration date. And we still watch it tick today. In companies that collapse when a founder leaves, in movements that die with a leader, in family fortunes that evaporate in a generation. Alexander had conquered a world. In one night, everyone discovered how little agreement existed about who should inherit it. The men standing around his bed understood this instantly, and each of them ran the same calculation at the same moment. There is no heir who can actually rule. Whoever moves first and smartest takes a piece of the world. History remembers them as the Diadochi, a Greek word meaning the successors. And the opening lineup did not favor the man our story follows. There was Perdiccas, the senior cavalry commander, who, according to several sources, received Alexander's signet ring in those final days, giving him the strongest claim to run the empire as regent. There was Ptolemy, shrewd and patient, who already had his eye on Egypt, the richest and most defensible province of all. There was Antigonus, called the One-Eyed, a hardened older general commanding in the middle of Anatolia. There was Lysimachus, assigned to Thrace. There was Antipater, the old regent, still holding Macedonia itself. And then, well down the list, there was Seleucus. At the moment Alexander died, Seleucus was somewhere in his early 30s, an officer of the elite infantry guard, respected, Certainly, the sources describe him as physically formidable, and one tradition says he once wrestled a bull with his bare hands. A story we should treat as flattering legend rather than fact. But flattering legends attach themselves to men. Other men admire. Still, he controlled no province. He commanded no personal army. In the great settlement that divided the empire immediately after Alexander's death, when the biggest men in the room carved the map among themselves, Seleucus received no territory at all. If you had asked anyone in Babylon that summer to name the future master of Alexander's Asian empire, almost no one would have said his name. And this is precisely why his story is worth a full night of telling. The other successors began the race holding provinces, treasuries, and armies. Seleucus began it, holding almost nothing but a reputation and a talent that would only become visible over time. A talent for surviving, for waiting, for recognizing which fights mattered and which did not. The wars of the successors would grind on for 4 decades, and they would bury most of the men who stood around that bed in Babylon. The man who ended up with the largest share of the world was the one who started with the smallest. How he did it begins with a city he was given, a city he lost, and a desperate ride back to it with only a handful of companions. That city was Babylon itself. Chapter 2. The man who held the anchor. Every empire has an origin story it tells about itself. The Seleucid Empire told one about an anchor. The legend, preserved by later Greek writers, said that Seleucus was born with a birthmark shaped like an anchor, and that his true father was not his human father, an officer named Antiochus, but the god Apollo himself. His descendants stamped the anchor on their coins for 2 centuries. Let us be clear about what this story is. It is royal propaganda, invented, or at least polished, after Seleucus became great. Exactly the way Alexander's family had claimed descent from Hercules. Ancient kings did not have constitutions to legitimize them. They had stories, and the fact that the Seleucids needed such a story tells you something true, which is that Seleucus began as an ordinary Macedonian nobleman, without a drop of royal blood, and everyone knew it. So, how does an ordinary officer become the heir to half the world? Not quickly, and the first years after Alexander's death show us just how easily he could have vanished from history entirely. In the first division of power at Babylon, as we saw, Seleucus received no province. What he received instead was one of the highest military commands under Perdiccas, the regent who held Alexander's signet ring. On paper, this was a promotion. In practice, it chained his fate to another man's ambition. Perdiccas tried to hold the whole empire together under his own authority, and the other generals refused to accept it. War came within 2 years. In 321 BC, Perdiccas marched against Ptolemy in Egypt, and the campaign went wrong almost immediately. The sources describe a disastrous attempt to cross the Nile, in which perhaps 2,000 men drowned or, according to the grimmer accounts, were taken by crocodiles. The army's patience snapped. What happened next is reported plainly by our sources. A group of senior officers walked into the regent's tent and killed him. And Diodorus, one of our main historians for this period, names Seleucus as one of the men involved. Sit with that for a moment, because it is the first hard fact we have about Seleucus as an independent actor, and it is not a flattering one. He rose by helping to murder his own commander. A romantic telling of this story would skip past that. An honest one cannot. The age of the successors was a knife fight, wearing the costume of a government, and Seleucus survived it because he was willing to use the knife. The reward came at the next great division of the empire, held at a place called Triparadisus in Syria. This time, Seleucus got territory, and not just any territory. He received Babylonia. the ancient heartland of Mesopotamia, with the city of Babylon at its center. It is worth pausing to understand what Babylonia was, because it explains everything Seleucus later became. This was not frontier land. This was one of the oldest, continuously civilized places on earth. Athens, irrigated river country between the Tigris and the Euphrates that had been feeding empires for 2,000 years before any Macedonian ever saw it. It generated enormous agricultural wealth. It sat on the crossroads between the Mediterranean world and Iran and India. Whoever held Babylonia held the economic anchor of Asia. And Seleucus seems to have understood that holding it required more than a garrison. Our evidence includes Babylonian cuneiform records, chronicles kept by local priests and astronomers who recorded events year by year in their own language, for their own purposes, with no interest in flattering any Greek king. Read alongside the Greek sources. They leave the impression of a governor who worked with the ancient institutions of the land, respected its temples, and did not simply squeeze it. That impression is not a portrait, and we should not pretend it is. But it is the beginning of something the other successors were not accumulating. Then, in 316 BC, he lost everything. The giant of the age at that moment was Antigonus, the one-eyed, the old general from Anatolia, who had spent the years since Triparadisus destroying his rivals and swallowing their territories one by one. Fresh from a victory in Iran, Antigonus arrived in Babylon with an overwhelming army and began behaving not as a colleague but as a master. He demanded that Seleucus present formal accounts of the province's revenues, a demand from a superior to a subordinate. Seleucus read the situation correctly. The demand was a pretext. Submitting meant, sooner or later, arrest or death. So he ran, with just a few dozen horsemen. The sources say around 50. He abandoned his rich province and fled west across the desert to Egypt, to the court of Ptolemy. Here is the moment where the story of the Seleucid Empire very nearly fails to happen. In 316 BC, Seleucus is a landless refugee with 50 followers, living on another man's hospitality. Nearly every other officer in his position in that era simply disappeared into someone else's service and out of history. What saved him was patience and the arithmetic of fear. Antigonus had grown so powerful that all the remaining successors, Ptolemy in Egypt, Lysimachus in Thrace, Cassander in Macedonia, understood that they would each be devoured in turn unless they combined. A grand coalition formed, and Seleucus, the guest with no land, made himself useful within it, commanding fleets for Ptolemy and, according to Diodorus, constantly urging the coalition onward. His moment came in 312 BC. After Ptolemy defeated Antigonus's son, Demetrius, at the Battle of Gaza, the road east lay briefly open. Seleucus asked Ptolemy not for a fleet or an army, but for a tiny force. The figures in Diodorus are around 800 infantry and 200 horsemen. With roughly 1,000 men, he set out to recover a province defended by garrisons many times that size. It should not have worked, and the way it worked tells us something, though we should be careful about exactly how much. As he crossed into Mesopotamia, the accounts tell us veterans settled in the region came over to him, and local forces joined rather than resisted. When he reached Babylon itself, the city that had been taken from him by an army opened its gates to a column of 1,000 men. Diodorus, describing that welcome, points to the goodwill Seleucus had earned during his earlier years of governing. If that account is any guide, then something he had built without knowing he was building, it had just become the most valuable asset he owned. Reputation is the slowest currency to earn, and the only one that survives losing everything else. The other successors believed power lived in armies. Seleucus had just shown it could also live in memory. That idea will follow this family for 200 years. Mostly as an inheritance they spend, rather than renew, and it is worth keeping in your pocket for the rest of the night. That return, in 312 BC, would become year one of what we now call the Seleucid era. The counts spread across the Middle East and continued in use among some communities for well over 1,000 years. One of the first continuous year numbering systems in human history, and a direct ancestor of the way you and I number our years today. We will come back to it at the end of the story, because it may be the most durable thing this dynasty ever made. But a returned governor is not yet a king, and Antigonus was not finished. To keep Babylon, Seleucus would have to beat the strongest military machine of the age. To do that, he would first ride east, almost to India, and come back with the strangest weapon of the ancient world. Chapter 3. Ipsus and the Elephant Gamble. Between the years 312 and 308 BC, while the other successors fought each other in the west, Seleucus did something none of them expected. He turned his back on them and rode east. The eastern half of Alexander's conquests, the vast Iranian plateau and the lands beyond, had been drifting since Alexander died. Satraps governed like private kings. Seleucus moved through these provinces, Media, Persis, and onward, bringing them one by one under his authority. Our sources for these campaigns are thin, mostly brief notices in later writers, so an honest storyteller admits we cannot reconstruct them in detail. What we know is the result. Within a few years, the man who had returned to Babylon with 1,000 soldiers controlled the entire eastern half of the former empire. And at the far edge of that world, he met a wall. The wall's name was Chandragupta Maurya. While Alexander's generals were dismembering his empire, a young Indian ruler had been building one. Chandragupta had united the Ganges Valley, then swept west into the Indus Valley, into the very provinces Alexander had conquered, and forged the largest state in the history of the Indian subcontinent to that point, the Mauryan Empire. When Seleucus arrived at the frontier around 305 BC, he was not facing a rebellious governor. He was facing an emperor commanding resources that dwarfed his own, in a land Macedonian veterans remembered as the place where Alexander's own army had finally refused to go further. Some kind of conflict followed. The sources, frustratingly, tell us almost nothing about the fighting itself, and some historians suspect there was little serious fighting at all. What they record clearly is the settlement, and the settlement is one of the most remarkable deals of the ancient world. Seleucus relinquished his claims to the easternmost territories, lands along and beyond the Hindu Kush, though the exact extent of what changed hands is still debated by historians, and we should not pretend we hold a treaty with borders drawn like a modern map. In exchange, alongside a marriage agreement whose details are lost, he received 500 war elephants. To modern ears, this sounds like trading a country for a zoo. So let us be precise about what 500 war elephants meant in the year 303 BC. Elephants were the shock weapon of the age. They could terrify horses that had never encountered them, disrupt cavalry formations, and break massed infantry under the right conditions. And they could not be manufactured. They had to come from India, through territory Seleucus now bordered, and no Western rival could acquire them in numbers. 500 of them was a force without precedent. Alexander himself had never commanded a fraction of that number. But the genius of the deal is only half military. Seleucus gave up claims he could not realistically enforce, provinces at the extreme end of impossible supply lines, facing a superpower, populated by peoples with no reason to love Macedonian rule. In accounting terms, he traded a liability that looked like an asset for an asset that looked like a toy. Most rulers in his position would have fought a ruinous war for the prestige of keeping Alexander's conquests intact. Because giving up territory feels like defeat, even when it is arithmetic. Seleucus could distinguish between what made him look strong and what made him actually strong. It is among the rarest abilities in politics, and we will spend the second half of this story watching his descendants lose it. He then marched his elephants 3,000 miles west, because the reckoning with Antigonus had finally come. By 302 BC, Antigonus, the one-eyed, and his brilliant son Demetrius stood at the height of their power, controlling Anatolia, Syria, and much of the Aegean world, and openly aiming at the whole empire. Against them, the surviving successors formed their last great coalition. Lysimachus crossed from Thrace into Anatolia. Cassander sent troops from Macedonia, and up from the east came Seleucus. With an army, the ancient sources number at tens of thousands, and the elephants. The armies met in 301 BC at a place in central Anatolia called Ipsus. It was, by the numbers our sources give, among the largest battles the ancient world had yet seen. Roughly 150,000 men on the field in total. The figures come mainly from Plutarch, writing centuries later, and ancient battle numbers always deserve caution. But no one doubts the scale was enormous. The battle turned on a single mistake. Demetrius, commanding his father's cavalry, charged the enemy horse, won his duel, and did what dashing cavalry commanders have done throughout history. He chased. He pursued the beaten enemy far from the battlefield, leaving his father's infantry uncovered. Into that gap, according to Plutarch's account, Seleucus moved the elephants. He formed them into a living wall between the pursuing cavalry and the battlefield, and horses, unwilling to face elephants, could not return. Demetrius had won his corner of the battle and lost the ability to matter. The coalition then ground down the isolated infantry of Antigonus, and the old general, in his 80s and still refusing to leave the field, died under a rain of javelins, waiting for a son who could not reach him. There is a grim symmetry worth noticing. Antigonus fell because his son was too aggressive at the wrong moment. He had spent 40 years being exactly that aggressive himself, and it had made him the greatest power of the age, right up until the moment it killed him. The habits that build fortunes and the habits that destroy them are often the same habits, applied on different days. Ipsus ended the dream of reuniting Alexander's empire. No one ever seriously attempted it again. The victors divided the world of the one-eyed among themselves, and in that division Seleucus received Syria, the land bridge connecting his eastern realms to the Mediterranean. The refugee of 316 BC now ruled from the Aegean's doorstep to the borders of India, the largest of all the successor states. Yet inside the victory, a splinter was left in the wound, the southern part of Syria. The coastal corridor of the eastern Mediterranean had been quietly occupied during the campaign by Ptolemy, who had skipped the Battle of Ipsus entirely. By the coalition's own agreements, the land should have gone to Seleucus. Ptolemy simply kept it, and Seleucus, remembering that Ptolemy had sheltered him when he had nothing, declined to fight his old friend over it, while pointedly refusing to renounce the claim. Two friends, one debt of honor, one strip of disputed coastline. Out of that small unresolved thing would come 6 wars, fought across 100 years by their descendants. Wars that would drain both empires, while their true enemies grew in the shadows. But that is ahead of us. First, Seleucus the survivor must become Seleucus the builder. What he did next was not to win another battle. It was to sign his name across the map of Asia. Chapter 4. An Empire of Cities. There is a habit of mind that treats conquerors and builders as different kinds of people. The conqueror takes, the builder makes. History rarely gives you both in one man. And when it does, the building is usually what lasts. After Ipsus, Seleucus was around 55 years old. He had spent his entire adult life at war, and instead of resting, he began one of the largest programs of city founding the ancient world ever saw, from a single ruler. The ancient sources credit Seleucus and his son with founding or refounding dozens of cities. The geographer Strabo and the later writer Appian, who wrote a history of Seleucus's dynasty, describe a landscape deliberately reorganized around new urban centers. 16 of them were named Antioch, after his father. 5 were named Laodicea, after his mother. Several were named Apamea, after his Persian wife. And at least a few were named Seleucia, after the man himself. Notice what he was doing with those names. He was writing his family across the map, so that a merchant traveling from the Mediterranean to Iran would pass through the names of the royal house at every major stop. Rome would later do something similar with its colonies, and empires ever since have understood the trick. You do not fully own a land until ordinary people speak your name in their directions. Before we walk through those cities, one caution, because it will shape how you should picture everything that follows. These foundations were Greek islands, not a Greek flood. Around them, in the villages where the vast majority of the empire's people actually lived, life continued in Aramaic and Persian and a dozen other languages, under local customs, worshipping local gods, largely as it had for centuries. Modern scholarship stresses this continuity, and stresses too how much the Seleucid kings themselves adapted to it, presenting themselves in Babylon in the manner of Babylonian kings, honoring Babylonian temples, playing each local part as required. The empire was less a melting pot than a lattice, a Greek framework laid over societies that kept their own shape. That lattice gave the empire its reach. It also meant the empire's roots ran shallower than its map suggested. And when the framework cracked, there would be little underneath holding it together. Keep that image all night. It explains the ending of this entire story. Now, the framework itself, because it was genuinely magnificent. 2 foundations matter above all the others, and they pulled the empire in 2 different directions, which is a problem we will return to. The first was Seleucia on the Tigris, founded in Mesopotamia, a short distance from ancient Babylon. It was positioned to be the new commercial heart of the East, sitting on the river trade routes that connected the Persian Gulf to the caravan roads of Iran. It grew fast. Within a few generations, ancient writers ranked it among the largest cities on earth, with a population that Pliny, writing much later, put at 600,000. Ancient population figures are always soft, but every source agrees this was a metropolis of the first rank. Some of that growth came directly at Babylon's expense. Babylonian evidence records the transfer of at least part of the Greek and Macedonian population out of Babylon and into the new capital. And over the following generations, the pull of Seleucia gradually drew commercial life away from the older city. Babylon did not die. It remained a great religious and intellectual center for centuries more. Its temple active, its astronomers still watching the sky and writing down what they saw. But it was no longer the place where the future was being decided. And it must have been possible to feel that shift in the streets. Founding a new city is never free. Somewhere, an old city pays part of the bill. The second great foundation was Antioch, in northern Syria, near the Mediterranean coast. Founded in the year 300 BC and named for Seleucus's father, it would grow across the following centuries into one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. a place that would still be a major metropolis under the Romans, and a city we will visit again and again in this story, because it became the Western capital, and, eventually, the last refuge of the dynasty. Beyond the famous names, the deeper policy deserves your attention. These cities were settled heavily with Greeks and Macedonians, veterans of the wars, immigrants recruited from the old country with offers of land. Each carried the institutions of a Greek city, a council, a gymnasium where Greek education happened, a theatre, temples to Greek gods. Historians call the broader process Hellenization, the spread of Greek language and culture across the Middle East. And for the king, the cities were practical instruments as much as cultural ones, reliable recruiting grounds for the army, administrative centers where the king's language was spoken, islands of loyalty in an ocean of difference. A koine, a common Greek dialect, became the language of trade and government from the Aegean to the edges of Central Asia, and it would remain so for centuries, long after the dynasty that had helped spread it was dust. The Seleucid realm was one large part of a much larger Hellenistic world, alongside Ptolemaic, Egypt, and Macedonia, and the old Greek cities, that together made Koine the shared tongue of the Eastern Mediterranean. Centuries later, when the writers of the New Testament wanted a language that could reach that whole world, Koine Greek was the natural choice, and the network of Greek-speaking cities across Syria and beyond, many of them Seleucid foundations, was part of what made it natural. Hold the claim at that size. No, larger. And it is still astonishing. By the 280s BC, Seleucus was the last of the great successors still standing at full strength, an old man who had outlasted, outfought, or outweighted every rival of his generation. And then history handed him the kind of ending that ancient writers found almost too perfect. In 281 BC, at the Battle of Corupedium, Seleucus defeated Lysimachus, his old comrade from Alexander's army. The last other survivor of that generation, Lysimachus died on the field. The victory gave Seleucus control of Anatolia and opened the road to Macedonia itself, the homeland he had left more than 50 years before as a junior officer in Alexander's expedition. The sources tell us he intended to go home, to spend his final years as king of Macedonia, the land of his birth. He crossed the strait into Europe, and within weeks, he was dead, stabbed by a man he had taken under his protection, a refugee prince named Ptolemy Cyrannus, son of his old friend Ptolemy of Egypt. The killer wanted Macedonia for himself, and murdering his host was the shortest path to it. Appian records the irony without decoration. The survivor of 40 years of wars, the man who buried every rival, was killed not by an enemy but by a guest. At the threshold of home, he was around 77 years old. He had ruled for decades and had been, by the rough standards of his era, a comparatively decent king. It bought him nothing at the end. If Seleucus's life proves that patience and trust can build an empire, his death proves that no amount of either makes a man safe from the ambitions standing next to him. The empire passed to his son, Antiochus I, a man in his 40s who had already been governing the eastern provinces for years. He inherited the largest kingdom on earth, and with it, a question his father had never answered, because his father had never stopped moving long enough to face it. The question was this: can this thing actually be governed? Chapter 5. A problem with no solution. Distance was not the only weakness of this empire, but it amplified almost every other one, and no king of this dynasty ever found a way around it. Look at the shape of the realm at the death of Seleucus. From the western coast of Anatolia to the eastern edge of its territory, near the Hindu Kush, is a straight-line distance of roughly 2,500 miles. The practical travelling distance along actual roads was far longer. A royal messenger, moving fast, needed weeks to cross it. An army needed months. When trouble broke out at one end of the empire, the king would learn about it long after it had already grown, and his response would arrive later still. Now add the second layer of the problem. This immense corridor had not one centre of gravity but two. In the west, Syria, with Antioch and the Mediterranean world, facing Egypt and the Greek states. In the east, Babylonia, with Seleucia on the Tigris, facing Iran and the caravan trade. Two economic hearts, 1,000 miles apart, each pulling the king's attention toward itself, each with its own threats on its own horizon. A king standing in Antioch was, by definition, neglecting the east. A king campaigning in Iran was, by definition, leaving Syria exposed. The Seleucids understood the problem perfectly well. Their solution, used repeatedly, was a kind of institutionalized double kingship, where the ruler took his eldest son as co-ruler and stationed him at the other end of the realm. Seleucus himself had done this, placing Antiochus over the eastern provinces years before his death, as a solution to distance. It was genuinely clever, and for a generation it worked, but it carried a cost folded inside it. Every co-ruler could become a second centre of loyalty, a rival court in waiting, an heir with his own army and his own courtiers, whispering that the old man had reigned long enough. It worked when father and son trusted each other. Hold that thought for about 8 chapters. Antiochus I spent his entire reign, from 281 to 261 BC, living inside this structural problem, hurrying from one end of the empire to the other. He began his reign in the east and immediately had to race west, because his father's murder had thrown Anatolia and Syria into revolt and opportunism. He would spend 20 years as, essentially, an imperial firefighter. And then a genuinely new threat arrived, one that nobody in the Greek world had planned for. In the 270s BC, large groups of Celts, the same broad cultural world as the Gauls who inhabited what is now France, migrated out of the Balkans and crossed into Anatolia. These were not raiders on a season's adventure. They were whole peoples on the move, tens of thousands strong, with wagons and families, and they cut a corridor of destruction across Asia Minor that Greek cities remembered with horror for generations. Eventually, 3 of their tribes settled in central Anatolia, in a region that came to be called Galatia after them. If that name sounds familiar, it is because centuries later a Christian letter would be addressed to the people of this region. The Galatians. They were still there. Around 275 BC, tradition places a battle in which Antiochus met a Celtic army with a force that included his Indian war elephants. According to the account preserved in later sources, the Celts and their horses had never seen such animals, and their cavalry and chariots broke in panic. The victory earned Antiochus the title Soter, meaning savior, from the Greek cities he had protected. The ancient tradition also preserves a strange detail. Rather than celebrating, Antiochus is supposed to have wept at the sight of the field, saying the victory was shameful because it had been won by beasts rather than by the courage of men. Is the quote genuine? It comes from a late and moralizing source, so probably we should treat it as literature rather than transcript. But even as literature, it tells us how the ancient world thought about this dynasty. Even in victory, there was something strained about the Seleucids, something improvised, a sense of an empire held together by exotic expedients rather than deep strength. Because here is what the elephant victory did not do. It did not remove the Galatians. They stayed in central Anatolia for the rest of this story, sometimes as raiders, often as mercenaries, fighting in everyone's armies, always as a wedge of unpredictability in the middle of what was supposed to be Seleucid territory, and their presence encouraged something more corrosive. Local dynasts in Anatolia. Most importantly, a small state around the city of Pergamon, began building their independence in the spaces the king could not police. Pergamon, in these years, was a minor irritation. Remember the name anyway. It will help destroy this empire, not with armies of its own, but with a talent for inviting in someone else's. Step back and look at the pattern of Antiochus I's reign, because it is the pattern of the whole dynasty in miniature. No catastrophic defeat, no dramatic collapse, just a king in constant motion, plugging leaks, winning battles that solve nothing permanently, watching small losses accumulate at the edges. Provinces in the Far East were already loosening in these decades, simply because the king was always somewhere else. That loosening was not always a crisis, and it is worth being precise here, because the older histories were often too quick to call it decay. This empire was never a tightly administered block. It worked as a hierarchy of arrangements. Direct rule in the core, looser overlordship at the edges. Local kings and cities and temple authorities left to run themselves so long as they acknowledged the king and paid. That flexibility was a genuine strength. It let one dynasty govern a dozen incompatible worlds. But flexible arrangements have to be renewed by a present and credible king. And the arithmetic of distance meant no Seleucid king could be present in more than one place at a time. Every king after Antiochus I inherited the same terrible job description: ride fast, fight everywhere, and hold together by personal appearance what no institution was holding together for you. And yet, for all this, the empire's most draining conflict in the next 100 years would not come from Celts, or rebels, or the East. It would come from family, from the one border dispute Seleucus had left unresolved out of gratitude. The strip of coastline held by his old friend Ptolemy. The friends were dead now. Their sons and grandsons owed each other nothing. Chapter 6. The Syrian Wars. A family eating itself. If you want to understand how empires waste themselves, you could study 100 cases, or you could just study the Syrian Wars. Here is the object of the quarrel: a strip of the eastern Mediterranean coast, the region ancient writers called Coele, Syria, covering roughly the lands of modern Lebanon, Israel, and parts of Syria and Jordan. Valuable, certainly. Rich ports, cedar forests, caravan terminals, but not remotely worth what the two greatest powers of the Greek world would spend on it, which was 6 wars across more than a century. You remember how the dispute was born. After Ipsus, the land was assigned to Seleucus, and Ptolemy simply kept it. Seleucus, owing Ptolemy his survival, declined to fight, but refused to renounce the claim. In private life, an ambiguity like that gets buried with the people who made it. Between states, ambiguity is inherited at full value. Every Seleucid king was raised knowing the coast was rightfully his. Every Ptolemy was raised knowing possession was 9/10 of kingship. Neither side could yield without dishonoring an ancestor. The first 2 Syrian wars, fought across the 270s and down into the 250s BC under Antiochus I and his son Antiochus II, were indecisive affairs, and our sources for them are honestly quite poor. Fragments and inscriptions, more than narratives. Cities on the Anatolian coast changed hands. Fleets maneuvered. Treasure drained away on both sides. The border barely moved. Then the two dynasties tried something different. They tried peace. Sealed the ancient way with a wedding. And that wedding produced one of the darkest family stories in Greek history. Here is the arrangement. Antiochus II already had a wife, a formidable woman named Laodice, and sons by her to seal the peace. He agreed to set Laodice aside and marry Berenice, daughter of the Egyptian king, with the understanding, at least as Egypt saw it, that Berenice's future son would inherit the Seleucid throne. For Egypt, this was diplomacy as slow conquest, placing a grandson on the rival throne. For Laodice and her sons, it was a death sentence with a delay on it. For a few years, the arrangement held. Berenice bore a son. And then, in 246 BC, Antiochus II died suddenly while staying, of all places, at the residence of the wife he had set aside. Several ancient sources state or imply that Laodice poisoned him. Can we prove it? No. Kings died, young of natural causes, constantly in this era, and the poisoning charge comes mostly from writers hostile to Laodice. But what happened next needs no speculation, because all sources agree on it. Laodice proclaimed her own son, Seleucus II, as king. Berenice, in Antioch with her infant, appealed for protection to her brother, the new king of Egypt, Ptolemy III. Before help could arrive, agents of Laodice's faction killed the child, and then, despite promises of safety, killed Berenice too. Ptolemy III arrived to find his sister and nephew murdered, and what followed was less a war than a punitive earthquake. Within months, Antioch had fallen to him, and Egyptian forces had driven all the way into Mesopotamia, reaching and besieging Babylon itself, an advance confirmed by Babylonian records, as well as by the boastful inscription Ptolemy left behind. How much further he personally went, and how much of his own account was propaganda. Historians still debate, but hold the plain shape of it in your mind. 30 years after the founder's death, an Egyptian army stood at the walls of the city Seleucus had crossed a desert to reclaim, and it had come because of a murdered baby. The empire survived, barely, because Ptolemy could not stay. Trouble at home pulled him back to Egypt, and he withdrew with plunder, our sources describe in staggering terms, including, in a detail, Egyptian propaganda loved. Sacred statues Persia had once looted from Egypt, now carried home in triumph. But look at what the poison had actually dissolved. In the chaos, Laodice's second son rose against his brother, Seleucus II, splitting the dynasty into civil war. Brother against brother, mother maneuvering between her own children, and far away, at the eastern edges, provinces that had been loosening for years now found the center too distracted to notice them at all. The succession crisis of 246 BC did not create the empire's eastern problems, but it accelerated every one of them, and we will walk through that unraveling in the next chapter. The Syrian wars are usually taught as a border conflict. They were really a 100-year demonstration that dynastic states cannot separate policy from family. When a kingdom's foreign policy is written in marriage contracts, then every divorce is a diplomatic crisis, every stepmother is a faction, and every nursery is a battlefield. The Seleucids and Ptolemies were not two empires that happened to feud. They were one extended Macedonian family holding a 2-century argument with armies, and while they argued over a coastline their grandfathers had quarrelled about, the powers that would bury them both, Parthia in the east, Rome in the west, were growing up unwatched. Modern institutions have not entirely escaped this disease. Any organization where power is personal rather than institutional, family firms, dictatorships, certain political parties, reproduces the pattern. The fight for the top consumes the resources of the whole, and the fight is bitterest, precisely where the relationships are closest. There would be more Syrian wars, and one of them will matter enormously later in our story. But now we must do what the Seleucid kings themselves kept failing to do. We must look east, where 2,000 miles from the palace, intrigues of Antioch, in the very years when Laodice and Berenice were destroying each other, two provinces quietly walked out of the empire. One of them would become the strangest Greek-ruled kingdom that ever existed. The other would become the empire's executioner. Chapter 7. The Crack in the East. Around the year 250 BC. Give or take a few years, that historians still argue about. Two things happened at the eastern end of the Seleucid world, and at the time, hardly anyone in Antioch seems to have grasped what either of them meant. The first happened in Bactria, the rich province centered on the plains of what is now northern Afghanistan. Its governor, a Greek named Diodorus, stopped acting like a governor. The coins tell the story better than any chronicle. Coins from the region begin as normal Seleucid issues, then start showing Diodorus's own image while still naming the Seleucid king, and finally drop the king altogether. Whether there was a single moment of rupture, a declaration, a defining break, we simply do not know, and some historians caution that the coins may record a gradual loosening rather than a clean revolt. That caution actually deepens the point. Bactria shows us how royal authority at that distance could fade into something merely nominal, one coin issue at a time, the way a boat drifts from a dock when no one is holding the rope, because the kings were 1,000 miles west, fighting Egypt and each other. The second event looked even smaller. A people called the Pani, nomads from the steppes east of the Caspian Sea, moved south under a chieftain named Arsaces and seized a modest Seleucid frontier district called Parthia, in the northeast of modern Iran. Compared to Bactria, this seemed trivial. Bactria was a jewel. Parthia was a corridor of dry country that most maps barely bothered to label. Hold both of those events in mind. The shining Greek-ruled kingdom and the dusty nomad conquest, because history is about to grade them, and the grade is the opposite of what anyone expected. Let us stay with Bactria first, because Greco-Bactria is one of the great lost worlds of antiquity, and it rewards a few minutes of wonder. Here was a Greek-ruled kingdom with Greek kings. Greek coinage of astonishing artistic quality. Greek cities with gymnasiums and theatres. Sitting in Central Asia, cut off from the Mediterranean by the width of Iran. Ancient writers called it the land of 1,000 cities. For a long time, historians could only guess what that meant, until archaeologists in the 20th century uncovered a city at a site in northern Afghanistan called Ai-Khanum, a full Greek city on the banks of the Oxus River, with a theatre, a gymnasium, templis, and inscribed Greek philosophical maxims copied. The inscription itself says, "From Delphi in Greece, 3,000 miles away." And Bactria did not stay put. In the following century, its kings crossed the Hindu Kush into India, carving out Indo-Greek kingdoms whose rulers appear in Indian sources as well as Greek ones. One of them, Menander, became a figure in Buddhist literature, remembered in a classic Buddhist text as a king who debated philosophy with a monk, and centuries after that, in the same broad borderlands, the Buddhist art of the region called Gandhara would produce some of the earliest human images of the Buddha, statues whose deep folded robes show, among many influences, the unmistakable echo of classical Greek sculpture. Scholars are clear that this art was a synthesis, drawing on Indian, Iranian, Central Asian, and later Roman currents as much as Greek ones, and it took shape long after the Greek kingdoms themselves had faded. But the Greek current was in the mixture, and it had flowed there through channels. This chapter describes history's most interesting consequences are almost never straight lines. They are rivers with many tributaries, and one tributary of Buddhist art runs back, distantly, to a governor named Diodorus, deciding one decade that the king was too far away to matter. I want to be careful here. As always, the romance of lost Greek kingdoms has sometimes run ahead of the evidence, and scholars today stress how much of Bactrian society remained local, Iranian and Central Asian, under a Greek crown. But even with every caution applied, it remains one of history's most extraordinary experiments. And the Seleucids did not lose it to an enemy army. They lost it to distance, one unanswered letter at a time. Now Parthia, the event everyone underestimated. The Parni were not city builders. They were horse peoples, and their military tradition centered on two instruments: the mounted archer, who could shoot accurately while riding away from you, and, in time, the heavily armored cavalryman, against infantry armies built on the Macedonian model. This style of war was poison. You could not catch them. You could not make them stand still and fight. And every mile of dry Iranian plateau favored them and starved you. The Seleucids did try to fix the East. That should be said clearly, because the dynasty is often caricatured as simply ignoring the problem. Seleucus II marched east against Arsaces in the 230s BC, and the campaign failed, partly because rebellion at home, that endless western pull, forced his attention back. The pattern from the previous chapters simply repeated. Every eastern campaign was interrupted by a western crisis, and every interruption gave the Parthians another decade to root themselves. Empires almost never fall to the threat they are watching. They fall to the threat they have classified as minor. Bactria looked like the big loss because it was rich and famous. Parthia looked like the small loss because it was poor and obscure. But Bactria, being Greek and civilized and distant, never came back to attack the empire's core. Parthia, being mobile, patient, and positioned across the empire's internal highways, eventually took everything east of the Euphrates. The dangerous rival is rarely the impressive one. It is the one whose way of life, your own strengths, cannot answer. And mounted archers on an open plateau were a question the Macedonian phalanx never learned to answer. By the 220s BC, then, the empire founded by Seleucus was visibly coming apart. The east breaking away, Anatolia slipping toward Pergamon and the Galatians, the dynasty fresh from civil war between brothers, Egypt triumphant on the coast. A fair-minded observer of that decade would have predicted the whole structure had perhaps a generation left. That observer would have been wrong, because history was about to hand the structure, something it rarely provides on schedule, the right man. He was 18 years old, the younger son of a defeated line, crowned only because his older brother had been assassinated. Within a few years of taking the throne, he would nearly lose it. And then he would spend 3 decades rebuilding almost everything this chapter has watched fall away, marching an army to the borders of India like a second Alexander, and earning the title by which history still knows him, Antiochus the Great. Chapter 8. Antiochus the Great, the man who almost won it all back. 18 years old. That is how old Antiochus III was in 223 BC, when the throne of a collapsing empire landed on him. He was not supposed to be king at all. His older brother had worn the crown, and had been murdered by his own officers while on campaign in Anatolia. After a reign of barely 3 years, the army was in the hands of generals who had just proven what they did to kings they did not respect. The East was gone or going. Egypt held the coast. And the new king was a teenager with no record, no victories, and no obvious reason to be obeyed. The first years went about as badly as you would expect. The governor of the eastern provinces, a man named Molon, looked at the boy on the throne and declared himself an independent king, taking Babylonia itself, the ancient anchor of the dynasty, into rebellion. At the same time, in Anatolia, the king's own relative Antiochus recovered territory from Pergamon, and then, ominously, began acting less like a servant and more like a rival. The empire now had 3 men wearing crowns inside it. What happened next is the first evidence of who Antiochus actually was, against the advice of his senior minister, who preferred to send generals. The young king marched against Molon in person. Our main source for these years is the historian Polybius, a Greek writing in the 2nd century BC, close to the events and generally regarded as one of the most careful historians antiquity produced. And Polybius gives us the details. When the royal army appeared, with the king himself at its head, Molon's soldiers began deserting. The rebellion collapsed almost at the moment of contact. Molon took his own life. The lesson Antiochus drew from this would define his reign. In a personal monarchy, the king's physical presence was itself a weapon. Soldiers who would happily fight some distant government hesitated to raise spears against the anointed king standing in front of them. For the next 30 years, Antiochus would be present, everywhere, at the head of every major campaign. Across a span of geography, no ruler since Alexander had attempted to cover in person. Then came the stumble. And it is important, because the empire's future was shaped as much by this defeat as by any victory. Young and confident after crushing Molon, Antiochus launched the 4th Syrian War, aiming at last to take the disputed coast from Egypt. For 2 years he won steadily, and then, in 217 BC, at a place called Raphia near Gaza, he met the full Egyptian army and lost. Polybius describes it as one of the largest battles of the age. Well over 100,000 men combined, elephants on both sides. The African elephants of Egypt against the Indian elephants of Asia. Antiochus, leading a cavalry charge, won his own corner of the field and chased too far. And while he was away, his center broke. If that error sounds familiar, it should. It is exactly what Demetrius did at Ipsus, in the battle that had made this dynasty an empire. Military families inherit talents. They also inherit temptations. Raphia should have broken his reign. Instead, something interesting happened. Antiochus absorbed the defeat, made peace with Egypt on tolerable terms, turned around, and used the intact core of his army to destroy the rival closer to home, executing the usurper Antiochus after a long siege. Then, with the West stabilized, he did the thing that earned him his title. In 212 BC, Antiochus marched east. The expedition that followed lasted roughly 7 years, and ancient writers called it his anabasis, his march up country, deliberately echoing the language used for Alexander. Polybius and other sources let us trace the arc. He brought Armenia back to obedience. He pushed into Parthia and fought the Seleucid king into a settlement that acknowledged Seleucid supremacy. He crossed into Bactria and besieged the Greek king there, a ruler named Euthydemus, for 2 years, before accepting a negotiated arrangement in which Bactria too acknowledged his overlordship. He crossed the Hindu Kush into the Kabul Valley and renewed the old friendship with an Indian king. Coming away with more war elephants, he rode down through Arachosia and along the edge of the Persian Gulf. And when he finally returned west, around 205 BC, the map of the empire looked, on parchment, almost the way it had looked under Seleucus, the founder. The Greek world gave him the name Megas, Antiochus the Great. Now, the honest asterisk, because this story demands one. Look closely at how those eastern victories ended. Parthia was not destroyed. It was accommodated. Bactria was not retaken. It was befriended. What Antiochus rebuilt was not the hard sovereignty of the founder, but a web of submissions. Kings bowing to a stronger king while keeping their armies and their ambitions. It was empire as performance, magnificent and real at the same time, and durable, exactly as long as the man at the center remained strong and present. Polybius, who admired him with reservations, understood this perfectly. The Anabasis restored the empire's prestige. Whether it restored the empire's substance would only be revealed by the first serious shock. For the moment, there was no shock in sight, only opportunity. In 204 BC, the king of Egypt died, leaving a child on the throne, and the great rival power dissolved into regency intrigues. Antiochus struck. In the Fifth Syrian War, at the Battle of Panium, around 200 BC, his army finally crushed the Egyptians, and the prize his ancestors had pursued for a century, the coast of Coel, Syria, at last became Seleucid. 100 years of family grievance. Settled. Jerusalem. Incidentally, passed under Seleucid rule in this settlement, welcomed by many of its inhabitants, who received royal guarantees of their traditional laws. File that detail away. It becomes one of the hinges of this entire story 2 chapters from now. Stand where Antiochus stood in the year 196 BC and try to see the world through his eyes. He had reigned for nearly 30 years. He had recovered the East, humbled Egypt, avenged Raphia, won the ancestral coast. He was, by any reasonable measure, the dominant Hellenistic monarch of his age. He now crossed into Europe to recover Thrace, territory his ancestor, Seleucus, had won in the last battle of his life. It must have felt like the closing of a great circle. He knew, of course, that there was a new power in the far west, a republic of Italian farmers that had just finished a terrible war with Carthage. Their envoys had already met him, and their tone had been strange, confident in a way that did not match his map of the world. He does not seem to have been alarmed. Why would he be? They were far away, exhausted by their own war, and they had no king. He had faced every kind of enemy the world could offer. He had never faced anything like Rome. Almost no one had. Chapter 9. The elephant meets the wolves. To understand the collision that is coming, you have to understand that Antiochus and Rome were reading from different rulebooks, and neither could quite believe the other was serious. Antiochus came from a world where wars between kings ended in settlements. A defeated rival was accommodated, married into, given a smaller throne and a place at the table, because today's enemy was tomorrow's ally, and the map was always adjustable. Rome had that instinct too. In its way, it made treaties, kept client kingdoms, cut deals. But Rome had just come out of a war with Hannibal of Carthage, in which it lost tens of thousands of men in single afternoons. Watched an enemy army camp inside Italy for 15 years, and refused at every stage to negotiate. That experience had hardened something. Rome had learned that it could absorb catastrophe and still dictate the ending, and it now expected its demands to be treated as facts rather than as opening positions. When Roman envoys told Antiochus to stay out of Europe and keep his hands off the Greek cities. He heard the beginning of a conversation. They meant the end of one. It was the most expensive misreading of his life. Into this already flammable situation walked one more man, and his arrival tells you how small the ancient world could be. In 195 BC, Hannibal himself, driven from Carthage by political enemies, arrived at the Seleucid court as a refugee. The most powerful king of the Greek world and Rome's most feared enemy were now in the same palace. Polybius and the Roman historian Livy both record the alliance, and both record its strange sterility. Antiochus gave Hannibal honor, but never gave him a real army, and our sources suggest the king's advisors distrusted the foreigner while the king himself, perhaps, did not relish sharing glory with a legend. If there was a single moment when the ancient world's fate could have swung, it was in the war count to strike at Italy itself. To make Rome fight at home was heard politely and set aside. What might have happened had Antiochus handed his best fleet and 40,000 men to the greatest tactical mind of the age is one of history's great, unanswerable questions. What actually happened is that the king half committed to everything and fully committed to nothing. In 192 BC, invited by Greek factions hostile to Rome, Antiochus crossed into Greece with a force our sources describe as astonishingly small, around 10,000 men, apparently expecting Greece to rise and join him. Greece mostly watched and waited. Rome did not wait. A Roman army came north the following year and met him at, of all places, Thermopylae, the famous narrow pass where the Spartans had once stood against Persia. Antiochus held the pass. The Romans did precisely what the Persians had done 3 centuries earlier, sent a force over the mountain trail to take the defenders from behind. The king who ruled from the Aegean to the edge of India escaped to Asia with only a fragment of his army. Even now, he seems not to have grasped what he was in. Kings of his world would have taken the win and made terms. Rome instead built a fleet, fought and won a series of naval battles with the help of its allies from Pergamon and Rhodes, and did what no Roman army had ever done. It crossed into Asia. The two armies met in the winter of 190 to 189 BC at Magnesia, in western Anatolia. The ancient source, mainly Livy and Appian, give figures that historians treat with caution: roughly 30,000 Romans and allies against a Seleucid host, perhaps twice that size. A spectacular multi-ethnic array. The Macedonian-style phalanx at the center, armored cavalry from Iran, scythed chariots, camel riders from Arabia, and dozens of war elephants. It was the whole empire in miniature. Every province represented, marshalled for a single day. And the battle followed a script we have now seen twice before. Antiochus, in his early 50s, and still leading from the saddle, personally took his heavy cavalry against the Roman flank in front of him, shattered it, and pursued, riding hard for the enemy camp. Ipsus, Raphia, Magnesia, 3 times across a century. A commander of this dynasty won his own duel and rode out of the battle that mattered. While the king chased, his center was destroyed. The scythed chariots panicked and cut lanes through their own lines. The phalanx was shot to pieces where it stood, and by evening the Seleucid field army had effectively ceased to exist. Livy's casualty figures, tens of thousands, are likely inflated, as ancient figures usually are. The strategic result needs no inflation. After that evening, keeping Asia Minor was no longer something Antiochus had the power to negotiate. The peace that followed, the Treaty of Apamea in 188 BC, was not a treaty in the old sense of the word. It was a sentence. Antiochus surrendered all territory in Anatolia beyond the Taurus Mountains. The lands going mostly to Rome's small ally, Pergamon, which is how the minor irritation from 4 chapters ago swallowed a third of the empire without winning a major battle of its own. He surrendered his war elephants. He surrendered his navy beyond a token squadron. He agreed to hand over Hannibal, who escaped and would eventually take poison rather than fall into Roman hands. And he agreed to pay an indemnity of 15,000 talents of silver, a figure that requires translation to be felt. A talent was roughly 57 pounds of silver. 15,000 of them made this one of the largest war indemnities of ancient history. A sum, many times the crown's likely annual revenue, payable in installments across years. Magnesia did not kill the Seleucid Empire. Empires survive lost battles constantly, and this one had before. But the indemnity added a grinding fiscal pressure to a monarchy that already depended on squeezing revenue out of a vast and restless realm. And that pressure showed itself almost immediately, in the ugliest possible way. Within a year of Appian, Antiochus the Great was in the eastern province of Elymas, attempting to seize the treasure of a temple of Bel, sacred deposits accumulated over generations. Our sources connect the attempt directly to his need for funds. The local population rose in fury and killed him. That is how the greatest king of the dynasty died. In 187 BC. Not on a battlefield, but in a treasury raid. Struck down by worshippers defending their god's money. Be careful with the lesson, because it is tempting to make it too clean. The kings of this dynasty had always financed themselves from every source their world offered, and temple wealth had tempted rulers long before Rome existed. Not every later crisis flows from this debt. And when we reach Jerusalem in the next chapter, you will see how many separate forces were tangled together there. But something real did change at Appian. A dynasty whose founder had earned the goodwill of Babylonian priests now had its greatest king die as a temple robber. And the kings who followed inherited both the installment schedule and the example. The empire that emerged from Appian was still large, still rich, still the greatest state in Asia. But it was now a power that had been publicly beaten, paying tribute to a republic across the sea. And every court from the Nile to the Tigris had watched it happen. The son who inherited the throne would be an afterthought. The second son, though, the one who had lived in Rome itself as a hostage under the treaty, would come home, carrying ideas no Seleucid had ever held before. His name was Antiochus Epiphanes. God made manifest. His coins would say. His enemies would adjust one letter and call him the madman. Chapter 10. Epiphanes and the fire in Judea. The Treaty of Appian contained a clause that seemed minor at the time. Among its guarantees, the Seleucids handed over hostages to Rome, royal princes who would live in Italy as insurance for the payments. One of those hostages was a younger son of Antiochus the Great. He spent roughly a dozen years in Rome, watching the Republic from the inside, learning how its politics worked, how its elections felt, how its power moved. No Seleucid king before him had ever seen Rome up close. It made him, depending on which historian you ask, the best informed king of his dynasty, or the most deeply shaken one. In 175 BC, after his older brother was murdered by a court minister, this former hostage maneuvered his way onto the throne. He took the title Epiphanes, meaning God made manifest. Greek vits. According to Polybius, who knew the gossip of the age, adjusted a single letter and called him Epiphanes instead. The madman. Polybius gives us a genuinely strange portrait, and he is unusually valuable here because he lived close to these events and was deeply connected to the political world he describes. Though he remains an ancient observer with his own opinions and his own audience. A king who would slip out of the palace and wander the streets of Antioch, drinking with strangers, bathing in the public baths, showing up uninvited at ordinary people's parties. A king who staged elections in the Roman style for offices that did not exist in his system, canvassing for votes in a toga like a Roman politician, play-acting, the republic he had grown up watching. Ancient observers could not decide if this was charm, satire, instability, or all three. Modern historians cannot either. And the honest position is that the man remains genuinely hard to read across 22 centuries. What is not hard to read is his ambition. In 170 BC, Egypt, under an ambitious new government, tried to reopen the old wound and retake Syria. Antiochus Epiphanes did not merely defend, he counterattacked into Egypt itself and did what a century of his ancestors had failed to do. He broke the Egyptian army, overran most of the country, and even took custody of his own nephew, the young Egyptian king. Then he withdrew, leaving Egypt divided and, he assumed, managed. He assumed wrong. The Egyptians patched their quarrels the moment he left. So, in 168 BC, he invaded a second time, and this time he meant to finish it. His army closed on Alexandria, the capital. His fleet took Cyprus. The dream of the whole dynasty, the union of the two great successor kingdoms under one crown, was a siege away. And then, in a suburb of Alexandria called Eleusis, one old Roman walked up to him. The scene is recorded by Polybius and Livy, both, and it deserves to be told exactly, because almost nothing in ancient history says more in fewer moves. Rome, just that summer, had crushed the kingdom of Macedonia, the last great power between it and the East. The Senate sent a single envoy to Egypt, an elderly senator named Gaius Popilius Lanus, a man Antiochus had known personally during his hostage years. Popilius arrived at the king's camp with no army. He handed Antiochus a tablet carrying the Senate's demand: "Leave Egypt at once." The king, playing the game of his own world, said he would consult his advisors and reply. Popilius took the walking stick he carried, drew a circle in the sand around the king's feet, and said, "Decide before you step out of it." Understand what that circle meant. A king at the head of a victorious army, with the prize of a century in his hand. He was being told by one unarmed old man that if he stepped out of the circle with the wrong answer, Rome would come. There was a long silence. Our sources say, then Antiochus, the man who had lived in Rome, who knew exactly what had just happened to Macedonia, said he would do what the Senate asked. Only then did Popilius shake his hand. Historians have a name for that moment, the Day of Eleusis, and many treat it as the true end of an era, the moment the Hellenistic world's independence died, with no battle at all, everyone watching. Every court, from the Nile to the Tigris, absorbed the same lesson. The kings could fight each other. None of them could fight Rome. Power had not shifted that afternoon. That afternoon was simply when everyone found out it had already shifted. Now our story arrives at its most famous and most delicate chapter. So let me say clearly how I intend to tell it. What happened in Jerusalem in these years is preserved in two very different kinds of sources. The books of the Maccabees, written by Jewish authors within living memory, passionate, partisan, and precious, and the Greek and Roman historians, more distant and often confused about Jewish matters. Where they agree, we can be confident. Where they differ, I will say so. The background, which the sources broadly agree on, is that Jerusalem's own elite was divided. Some Jewish factions favoured deeper adoption of Greek customs. a gymnasium in the city. Greek education, integration into the wider Hellenistic world. Others saw this as a betrayal of the covenant and the law. The office of high priest, which under earlier Seleucid kings had been hereditary and respected, had become purchasable. Rival candidates outbidding each other at the royal court, and money ran through all of it. Because this was a monarchy under chronic fiscal strain, and offices, like everything else, had become revenue. What the king's court saw as an administrative auction, Judea experienced as sacrilege. The sequence of the catastrophe matters, so let us keep the dates straight. During the Egyptian Wars, in 169 BC, Antiochus came to Jerusalem amid disorder over the high priesthood and plundered the temple treasury. Then, after the humiliation at Eleusis in 168, rumors and violence in Jerusalem were treated as rebellion, and royal forces stormed the city. And then, around 167 BC, came something with no real precedent in the ancient world. According to 1st and 2nd Maccabees, royal decrees banned the practice of Judaism itself. Circumcision, the Sabbath, the sacrifices, the scrolls of the law, on pain of death, and the temple was rededicated to Olympian Zeus, with offerings made on its altar that the sources describe as deliberately abominable. Why did he do it? Here the sources genuinely diverge, and honesty requires showing you the divergence. The Maccabean books present a tyrant seeking to erase a faith. Some Greek sources suggest the king thought he was suppressing a political revolt and misunderstood the religion entirely. Some modern historians argue the persecution was proposed or shaped by radical, Hellenizing factions within the Jewish elite itself, using royal power against their domestic rivals. The truth is likely tangled among all three, and no serious scholar claims certainty. What is certain is the effect. Ancien Empire, including this one, had always run on a simple bargain: pay your taxes, keep the peace, and your gods are your own business. Antiochus Epiphanes, for whatever mixture of reasons, broke that bargain, and he broke it against a people for whom law and faith were not separable things. The explosion began in a village called Modin, when an aged priest named Mattathias refused the royal sacrifice, struck down a compliant Jew and the king's officer, and fled to the hills with his 5 sons. The eldest sons died fighting in the years that followed. The third son, Judah, called Maccabee, a name usually understood to mean the hammer, turned refugee bands into an army, and in a series of engagements that 2nd Maccabees narrates with exultation, defeated one royal force after another in the Judean hills, where big armies moved badly and local knowledge was worth regiments. In 164 BC, Judah's forces retook Jerusalem and cleansed and rededicated the temple. Hanukkah still commemorates that rededication. In Jewish homes all over the world, more than 2,000 years later. Pause on that for a moment. Nearly everything else in tonight's story survives only in ruins and footnotes. This survives as candlelight. Every winter. In living rooms on every continent. Whatever else the Seleucid dynasty left the world, it left this by negation. Antiochus Epiphanes never saw the end of the war he had started. He had gone east, chasing revenue in the Iranian provinces. And there, in 164 BC, he died of a sudden illness, with accounts differing on details and later traditions embroidering his deathbed with remorse or torment depending on who was telling it. He had reigned 11 years, come within a circle, drawn in sand, of uniting the Hellenistic world, and instead lit a fire in Judea that his successors could not put out. because the war there ground on for decades and ended with an independent Jewish kingdom under the Maccabean family, the first fully sovereign Jewish state in more than 4 centuries. Epiphanes was not a stupid man. By most evidence, he was among the ablest kings of his line. His catastrophe in Judea came from applying imperial logic. Money is fungible. Cults are interchangeable. Obedience is what matters. To a community for which none of those statements were true. It is the oldest imperial error there is. Mistaking what you can measure for what people will die over. States still make it. And with his death, the dynasty itself begins to come apart. Because Epiphanes left a 9-year-old heir, an ambitious general as regent, and, sitting in Rome, a nephew with a better claim watching for his moment. The age of kings is over. The age of claimants begins. Chapter 11. The Spiral. A dynasty murders itself. From this point forward, the history of the Seleucid Empire stops being the story of an empire and becomes the story of a family destroying itself in public, while its neighbours carve off the limbs. I want to be honest with you about a storytelling problem, because respecting your attention matters more than pretending completeness. The final century of this dynasty contains more than 20 claimants to the throne, many of them named Antiochus or Demetrius or Seleucus, several reigning simultaneously, some reigning twice, recited in full. It is unfollowable, and the ancient sources themselves grow thin and contradictory here. So I am going to do what a mapmaker does with a coastline too jagged to draw. I will give you the true shape, through the handful of figures who carry the meaning, and I will give each of those figures a plain label you can hold on to in the dark. The escaped hostage, the pretender, the queen, the captured king. The shape is a spiral, and tonight it turns 3 times. The first turn establishes the pattern, and it belongs to the escaped hostage. When Epiphanes died in 164 BC, the legitimate line of his older brother still existed, a prince named Demetrius, living as the replacement hostage in Rome. In his early 20s, clever and restless, he petitioned the Senate to go home and take his throne. The Senate refused, twice, because a child king with a weak regent suited Rome perfectly. And here Polybius steps into his own history, because Polybius was living in Rome as a detained Greek and was a personal friend of the young man. He tells us, essentially firsthand, how Demetrius stopped asking permission, slipped out of Rome on a Carthaginian ship, and sailed home to claim his crown. The child king and his regent were handed over by their own soldiers and killed. Demetrius I, the escaped hostage, ruled with energy, suppressed revolts, fought the Maccabees, and for a moment looked like a restoration. But notice what he had actually demonstrated. The throne no longer descended. It was taken. Every ambitious man in the eastern Mediterranean took the lesson. And Rome, annoyed at the escaped hostage, was happy to help the lesson along. Within a decade, a young man of obscure origin appeared, claiming to be a lost son of Epiphanes. Modern historians generally consider him an impostor. Ancient opinion was divided, and it did not matter, because Egypt, Pergamon, and Rome all recognized him instantly, not from belief, but from convenience. Backed by foreign money, the pretender defeated and killed Demetrius in 150 BC. A manufactured king now sat on the throne of Seleucus. The neighbors had discovered that the cheapest way to fight this empire was to sponsor its own civil wars, and they never stopped doing it again. Remember the co-ruler, the clever solution to distance from many chapters back. The son stationed at the far end of the realm with his own court and his own army. This is the bill for it. Arriving late, the dynasty had spent 2 centuries teaching itself that a second royal figure with an independent power base was normal, even necessary. By this generation, that habit had rotted into its final form. Every prince expected a throne. Every faction could find a prince. And any foreign power that wanted leverage over Syria simply had to fund one. The second turn belongs to the queen, and she is the most extraordinary figure of the whole late dynasty. Cleopatra Thea, Princess of Egypt, not the famous Cleopatra of Caesar and Antony, who comes a century later, but her ancestral relative, was married to the pretender to seal his Egyptian backing. When her father switched sides, she was remarried to the next claimant, the son of the escaped hostage, a young man we will call the captured king, for reasons about to become clear. And when that husband was lost to her, in a way I will tell you shortly, she married his younger brother. 3 husbands, 3 kings, 3 factions. One woman gradually understanding that she herself was the only continuity the dynasty had left, and drawing the logical conclusion, ancien source, hostile to powerful women, almost by reflex, must be read carefully here. But the core events are multiply attested and grim. Her second husband, returning unexpectedly after years away, was killed, with our sources implicating the circle around her. When her eldest son claimed the throne with too much independence, he was killed too. And Appian, along with other sources, reports the tradition that his own mother ordered it. She then ruled jointly with a younger son, appearing beside him on coins. The first woman in the dynasty's history portrayed as a reigning monarch, and the tradition preserved in our sources says she eventually prepared a cup of poison for this son as well, that he had been warned, and that he insisted his mother drink it first. She died by the instrument she had prepared. In 121 BC, I have told you before when a story is too neat to trust, and that poisoned cup has the shape of moral folklore. So, hold it loosely. But even if the final scene was polished by ancient storytellers, the verifiable career around it, the serial marriages, the coinage, the dead husbands and sons, is documented, and it tells you what the monarchy had become. Not a government with a family at its head, but a family with a government attached, in which the closest relationships were now the most lethal ones. In the founder's generation, the danger stood outside the walls. In this generation, it slept down the hall. The third turn of the spiral is the one that empties the map. And it happened while the palaces were busy with all of the above. Judea completed its independence under the Maccabean dynasty and began to expand. The Greek cities of the coast started issuing their own coinage, declaring themselves free, because no king was strong enough to say otherwise. Fragments in the north declared their own small kingdoms, and in the east, Parthia stopped raiding and started harvesting. Under a great king named Mithridates I, Parthian armies took Media in the 140s BC, and then came down off the plateau into the richest prize of all, Babylonia, the anchor, the province the founder had crossed a desert with 1,000 men to reclaim, the land whose goodwill had launched the whole dynasty. In 141 BC, it passed to the horse lords and Seleucia on the Tigris. The founder's city of 600,000 souls passed with it. The astronomers of Babylon, still keeping their tablets after all these generations, did what they had always done. They simply began dating their observations by a new king's name. 2,000 years of Mesopotamian civilization changed hands. And in Antioch, absorbed in the family war, it barely registered. One more loss from these years, and then the chapter can rest. The captured king, Cleopatra Thea's second husband, earned his label by marching east to try to win Babylonia back. He fought bravely and initially well. And then, in 138 BC, the Parthians took him alive. They did not kill him. They kept him for 10 years. A Seleucid king held as a house guest and a bargaining chip, married off to a Parthian princess. Wheeled out whenever Parthia wanted to threaten Syria with a rival claimant. There may be no single image that better captures what this dynasty had become. A king of the house of Seleucus, alive and well, and useful to everyone except his own empire. Stop and breathe here for a moment, because the night has grown heavy, and you have earned a summary before the last acts. The East, gone. The Anchor province, gone. One king a prisoner in Parthia. A queen killing her way through her own family in Antioch. And Rome watching it all with the patience of a creditor. A fair judge would say the story was over. The story was not quite over, because the youngest brother of the captured king was about to take the stage, and he was, by the common judgment of ancient and modern historians alike, the last great man this family produced. Chapter 12. The Last King and the Silver Coffin. His name was Antiochus VII, and history sometimes calls him Sidetes, after the city where he was raised. He was still a young man when his brother was taken by the Parthians in 138 BC, living in exile. A prince of a dynasty that had become a punchline. He landed in Syria, married his brother's wife, Cleopatra Thea, because marrying the queen was how one claimed the wreckage, and set about proving that the wreckage could still be a kingdom. The early years were a quiet astonishment. He crushed the usurper, then holding Antioch. He restored order in Syria for the first time in a generation, and he dealt with Judea in a way that deserves attention, because it shows a mind learning from his family's worst mistake. After a hard siege of Jerusalem, with the city at his mercy, his advisers urged him, our sources say, to destroy it and scatter its people. He refused. He granted terms, hard but survivable, tribute and disarmament, and he pointedly guaranteed the practice of the Jewish religion, declining to repeat the sacrilege of Epiphanes. Jewish tradition itself remembered him with a certain grudging respect. It was the act of a man who understood that his ancestors had confused what they could measure with what people would die over. Then, in 131 BC, he gathered everything his shrunken world could give, and marched east to take it all back. Our sources call it the last great royal army of the dynasty, and some give figures as high as 80,000 fighting men. Numbers we should treat with the usual caution, but which every account agrees were enormous. It was the final, full mobilization of the Seleucid state. Every reserve of money and manpower committed to a single throw. The objective was nothing less than the reversal of 30 years of history. Babylonia, Media, the East entire, and for a year, it worked. It genuinely worked. He beat Parthian forces in 3 battles. Babylonia came back. Cities across Mesopotamia and Media opened their gates, some of them rising against their Parthian garrisons to do it. And the Parthian king sued for terms. For one winter, the map of the world looked the way it had looked under Antiochus the Great, and a young man had done it with an empire that everyone had already written off. Winter is the operative word. The vast army could not camp in one place, so it dispersed into winter quarters across the cities of the East, and the cities, which had cheered its arrival, discovered what it cost to feed it. Resentment gathered in the snow. The Parthians, who had asked for negotiations, used the pause to prepare something else. and in the spring of 129 BC, they struck the scattered garrisons everywhere at once, while their king moved with his main force against Antiochus himself, who had with him only a fraction of his men. His officers urged retreat to the nearest stronghold. He refused, and the refusal was in character, because everything he had won by refusing. This time the arithmetic did not care. The sources describe the last fight as hopeless and brief. Antiochus VII died on the field in the spring of 129 BC, or by some accounts, by his own hand at the moment of capture. The Parthian king, our sources say, sent his body home to Syria in a silver coffin, a gesture of respect from one professional to another. And something more than that. It was the courtesy of an heir at a funeral, because the Parthians understood exactly what had died. Historians of the period generally mark that spring as the true death of the Seleucid Empire, and I agree with them. Everything east of the Euphrates was gone now, permanently. No Seleucid army would ever cross that river again. Stay in the east for a while, though, before we follow the Coffin west, because half of this story happened out here, and history rarely pauses to record what it feels like when an empire leaves a place forever. The remarkable thing is how little it felt like an ending. The Parthians did not burn the Greek East. They bought it, managed it, and flattered it for generations. Parthian kings stamped Greek legends on their coins, many carrying the title Phil-Hellene, friend of the Greeks, a nomad dynasty advertising in the language of the people it had conquered. Seleucia on the Tigris was not sacked. It kept its Greek council, its institution, its commercial life, and remained one of the largest cities on earth for centuries more, now paying its taxes east instead of west. The Parthians built their own capital, Ctesiphon, directly across the river, close enough that the two cities grew into one sprawling urban world. Greek merchant and Parthian court staring at each other over the water. When you hear, centuries later, of Rome fighting endless wars against Parthia on the Euphrates, understand what they were really fighting over. The prize was this: the river cities and trade wealth of the old Seleucid East. The transition had its cruelties, and honesty requires the exceptions. In the years right after the conquest, a Parthian governor ruled Babylonia harshly, and our fragmentary sources record punishments inflicted on cities that had welcomed Antiochus VII. In the far south, at the head of the Persian Gulf, a local ruler carved out an independent trading kingdom. One more fragment, flaking off the old imperial body. The East did not become Parthian overnight. It became a mosaic under Parthian management, which, if you think about it, is what it had been under Seleucid management. The lattice survived. Only the name at the top changed. And our most intimate witnesses, once again, are the astronomers of Babylon. Their tablets, the ones that had recorded Alexander's arrival and the founder's desert ride, simply continue through the change of masters, noting prices of barley and dates, eclipses, river levels, the occasional battle passing nearby. For ordinary Babylonians, the evidence suggests the fall of the Seleucid East was not an apocalypse. It was a change of address on the tax receipt. There is a lesson in that flatness. The dramas of dynasties, which fill our sources and this night, ran on top of a deeper world of planting and trading that outlasted every crown involved. One eastern thread remains, and it reaches toward the modern world. It was in precisely these decades that envoys from Han Dynasty China first reached this region, and the accounts they carried home described the caravan cities and the wealth of the lands the Parthians now ruled. The trade that would soon carry silk across Asia toward the Mediterranean. The network, later centuries would romanticize as the Silk Road, was far older and far more complicated than any one empire. But the cities of the old Seleucid East, Seleucia among them, became part of its Western machinery. The founders' cities outlived the founders' dynasty and went to work for the traffic of the whole world. Now follow the silver coffin back to Syria and watch what was left. The captured king, released by Parthia at the perfect moment to cause chaos, resumed his throne and his marriage, and was murdered within a few years. As we heard in the last chapter, the court spiraled on. Cleopatra, Thea, the poisoned cup, cousin against cousin. Over the following decades, rival kings partitioned Syria itself. One holding Antioch, another Damascus, each hiring mercenaries with money neither had, each inviting foreign backers to tip the balance. The cities, exhausted, began solving the problem locally. Some bought charters of freedom from whichever claimant needed cash that year. Some hired their own defenses. In the south, the Jewish kingdom and the rising Arab power of the Nabateans absorbed the borderlands. By around 100 BC, the empire of Seleucus the Conqueror consisted, in practice, of a handful of quarreling city districts in northern Syria, and the title King of Asia decorated men whose writ did not run to the horizon, visible from their palace roofs. We usually imagine empires ending at a stroke, a last battle, a burning capital. This one teaches the more common truth. Empires end operationally long before they end officially. The East was lost when the kings could no longer answer its letters. Decades before any Parthian army arrived. Syria was lost when its cities started buying their own security. Decades before anyone formally abolished the crown. By the 1st century BC, the Seleucid state had already died in function. What remained was a legal fiction wearing a diadem, waiting for someone with the authority to say out loud what everyone could see. Two men would say it. The first was an Armenian king with an empire builder's ambition. The second was a Roman with a schedule to keep. Chapter 13. The Walking Corpse and the Stroke of a Pen. The last act of a 250-year story deserves to be told with precision, because its very smallness is the point. By the 80s BC, the situation in Syria had become absurd even by the standards of the preceding half-century. Our sources for these years are thin and sometimes contradictory, which is itself evidence, because history stops keeping careful notes on powers that no longer matter. What we can reconstruct is a rotation of last-generation Seleucid cousins, at least 5 claimants in 2 decades, trading Antioch back and forth, some reigning for months. 1. Returning to the throne 3 separate times. The ancient writers barely bother to distinguish them. The coins, struck thinner and cruder each decade, do the bookkeeping for us. And then the exhausted patient sent for a foreign doctor. In 83 BC, the cities of Syria did something that tells you everything about how far the dynasty had fallen. A large faction of them invited a foreign king to come and rule them. Voluntarily, simply to make the chaos stop. The king they invited was Tigranes II of Armenia, called Tigranes the Great, who was at that moment assembling a substantial empire across the highlands north and east of Syria. Tigranes accepted, marched in against little resistance, and for the next 14 years, Syria was governed, comparatively peacefully, as a province of Armenia. The Seleucid line did not end. It was simply set aside, its surviving princes reduced to pensioners and fugitives, while a woman of the dynasty, Cleopatra Selene, held out with her sons in pockets of the south, keeping the family claim technically alive. Notice the sequence, because it is the final verdict of the governed. The cities of Syria offered a choice between their own ancient dynasty and literally any competent outsider. Chose the outsider by invitation. Legitimacy is a bank account. This chapter is what the zero balance looks like. Tigranes might have ruled Syria for decades, but his ally and father-in-law was Mithridates of Pontus, Rome's great enemy in the east. And when Rome finally moved against Mithridates in overwhelming force, the war reached Armenia too. In 69 BC, the Roman general Lucullus defeated Tigranes and, needing a local arrangement for Syria, allowed a Seleucid prince, Antiochus XIII, to take the family throne one more time. Ancient sources tell us the young man had earlier travelled to Rome itself, petitioning the Senate for years. A king, by blood, begging the Republic for a kingdom by permission. Lucullus granted what the Senate had not. For about 4 years. A Seleucid reigned again in Antioch, by Roman leave, which is another way of saying the dynasty's last reign was itself a Roman appointment. Then Lucullus was recalled, and his command in the east passed to a man with a very different temperament, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great. Pompey finished the war against Mithridates, and in 64 BC he arrived in Syria to reorganize the entire eastern Mediterranean, province by province, kingdom by kingdom, with the full authority of Rome behind him and a conqueror's impatience with loose ends. Antiochus XIII came before him and asked to be confirmed in his ancestral kingdom. And here, at the end of 2.5 centuries, our sources give us the scene. Recorded in summary by Justin and Appian, Pompey refused. The reasoning attributed to him was brutally practical. A king who could not defend Syria for the years he had held it, who had been the plaything of Armenians and Arab chieftains, would leave Syria as a vacuum for pirates and Parthians. Rome required order on this coast. Rome would therefore keep it. Syria was declared a Roman province in 63 BC. The last Seleucid was set aside without a battle, without a trial, without, as far as our sources record, an particular drama at all. He was handed back, in effect, to the local Arab dynasty who had been his keeper before, and within a short time he was dead, killed. Our fragmentary sources suggest, by that same host. The line of Seleucus the Conqueror ended not on a battlefield, but in an administrative decision. One item on a Roman general's very long list. Sit with the contrast for a moment, because the whole architecture of this night hangs on it. The empire began in 312 BC with a desperate ride. 1,000 men crossing a desert to take Babylon against impossible odds. And the gates opening, if Diodorus is our guide, because a population remembered being governed well. It ended in 63 BC with a signature, because a population remembered being governed badly, and because the only audience that mattered anymore was a republic 3 weeks' sail to the west. Between those two scenes lie all the mechanisms we have watched together. The geography that demanded a king be everywhere. The family system that turned every succession into a war. The fiscal pressure that turned protectors into plunderers. The neighbours who learned to farm the civil wars. No single villain killed the Seleucid Empire. It was dismantled by the compound interest of its own unsolved problems. And Pompey merely performed the paperwork. Rome, it is worth saying, kept almost everything the Seleucids had built. Antioch became the capital of Roman Syria and one of the greatest cities of the Roman world. The Greek cities kept their councils. The roads kept their traffic. The Greek language kept its empire long after the Macedonian kings lost theirs. Rome inherited, nearly intact, The urban and administrative world the Seleucids had helped shape, and found it too useful to change. And, on the Euphrates, Rome also inherited the Seleucids' unfinished war, facing Parthia across the same river, fighting over the same cities. For the next 300 years, a kingdom can die and still win, if what it planted keeps growing in someone else's garden. Whether that counts as victory is the question of our final chapter. But first, one last image from 63 BC. Somewhere in Antioch that year, a mint worker struck the last coins bearing a Seleucid king's face. And then the dies were put away. 249 years of anchors stamped in silver, from the Aegean to the Hindu Kush. And then, quietly, no more. Chapter 14. What the anchor held. Every empire leaves two estates behind. The first is the one it meant to leave. The borders. The dynasty. The name. The second is the one it leaves by accident. The Seleucids lost the first estate completely. The second is still in use. And part of it is in your house right now. Let us start with the humblest piece of it. Because for once, the humblest claim is also the strongest. The calendar. You will remember year 1, 312 BC. The desert ride. The gates of Babylon opening to 1,000 men. The count that began from that return. The Seleucid era did something no year count had quite done before. Every ancient people dated events by the reign of the current ruler. Year 5 of this king. Year 12 of that one. And time restarted with every coronation. The Seleucid count did not restart. It ran continuously, king after king, decade after decade, a single number line stretching forward without end. Scholars regard it as the first continuous year numbering system in wide, sustained use, and a direct forerunner of the eras that followed, the systems by which Jewish, Christian, and Islamic civilizations would each come to count their years. And it outlived everything. It outlived the dynasty, which stopped mattering. It outlived the empire, which stopped existing. Jewish communities used the Seleucid count in legal documents deep into the Middle Ages, more than 1,000 years after the last Seleucid king was dust. Some Eastern Christian communities carried it even longer. Historians have argued that this invention quietly changed how people think. Because a number line of years that never resets lets the mind travel. Lets you place your grandfather and your grandchildren and yourself on one road. Lets you imagine a deep past and a far future as parts of a single story. That is the centerpiece. And it is poor, Seleucid. The other legacies are shared. Tributaries flowing into larger rivers. And I will claim them at their honest size. Because you have trusted me all night, and I intend to keep it that way. There is the language. The Koine Greek that Seleucid cities helped carry from the Mediterranean towards Central Asia became the common tongue of the whole Eastern Mediterranean world. A world built by many hands. Ptolemies, and Macedonians, and merchants and colonists, as much as Seleucids. Within that shared world, the scriptures of the Jews were translated into Greek, and the writers of the New Testament later wrote in Greek. Because Greek was simply how you spoke to everyone at once. The Seleucids did not cause that. They were one of its larger causes. And their cities, in Syria and beyond, were part of the ground it grew from. Antioch itself, the dynasty's capital, became within a century of the last king one of the great early centers of Christianity. The city where, according to the Book of Acts, the followers of Jesus were first called Christians. The stage outlived the play and hosted a bigger one. There is the art, far to the east, which we glimpsed in chapter 7. The Greek kingdoms that broke off from the Seleucid East seeded a Greek artistic current into Central Asia, and centuries later, in Gandhara. That current flowed together with Indian and Iranian and Roman streams into a synthesis that produced some of the earliest human images of the Buddha, figures in deep folded robes that still carry a distant echo of the Mediterranean. No Seleucid planned it. No straight line runs from Antioch to those workshops. But the channel existed because the empire had existed, and a quarter of humanity now pictures its most sacred figure partly through forms that travelled east in the baggage of this story. And there are the cities, the most physical inheritance of all. Rome ruled its east from them for centuries. Parthia grew rich on them. The caravan trade that would later carry silk across Asia moved through their gates and markets. Some of them are still inhabited today, and one of them still carries the founder's family across the map. Because the Turkish city of Antakya is Antioch, its name worn smooth by 23 centuries of ordinary people speaking it in their directions, exactly as Seleucus intended. So we arrive at the question I promised at the beginning of this journey, and I want to put it to you directly, because the answer is genuinely arguable, and the best histories end in arguments worth having. Was the Seleucid Empire a failure? By the scoreboard of states, yes, and there is no rescuing the verdict. It lost its east to distance, its dynasty to itself, its independence to a circle drawn in sand, and its existence to a general's signature. Its structural flaws were visible within one generation and never repaired in 7 more. Judged as a political project, it is a 250-year lesson in the cost of unsolved problems. But judge it as a transmission, and the verdict wavers. This empire helped install Greek language, urban life, and habits of thought across the largest cultural corridor on earth. So durably that conqueror after conqueror chose to inherit rather than erase what it left. It connected worlds that had barely known each other. It provoked, in Judea, a resistance whose memory still burns in candlelight every winter. And it gave humanity a new way to hold time itself. Maybe the honest conclusion is that we have been measuring empires wrong all along. Ours included. States are vessels. Cargo is what matters. And history keeps the cargo far longer than it keeps the ships. Go back, one last time, to the room in Babylon where we began. June 323 BC. The fever, the silent king, the generals watching each other across the bed. If the old story is true, a dying voice says, to the strongest. And the greatest empire ever assembled begins to come apart before its founder's body is cold. We have followed what came next for 260 years. The junior officer, nobody watched. Riding back to Babylon with 1,000 men and a reputation. The elephants walking 3,000 miles to build a wall at Ipsus. The cities signing a family's name across Asia. The brothers and cousins at war. The poisoned marriages. The hammer in the Judean hills. The circle in the sand. The silver coffin travelling home. And at the end, a Roman general declining a beggar king's petition, and closing the account with a signature. Here is the strange thing about that deathbed prophecy. If it ever was spoken, everyone in the room heard, to the strongest, and thought it meant the strongest soldier. 40 years of war killed nearly all of them, proving it did not. The empire went instead to the man who understood that strength is what remains when everything else is taken from you. The man who could lose every province and be welcomed back, because he had spent years earning something none of his rivals thought to earn. His descendants inherited his empire and, forgot his method. They fought for the map and lost the memory. And when the last of them stood before Pompey holding nothing but a bloodline, he discovered what his ancestor had always known and his family had unlearned, that a crown with no trust behind it weighs nothing at all. Yet think about what survived the wreck. Not the throne, not the borders, the things that were useful to ordinary people, a language they could trade in, cities they could live in, a way of counting years that let a farmer in Babylon and a scribe in Antioch agree on what day it was. The dynasty spent 2 centuries fighting over the crown, and the crown is gone without a trace. The tools they gave the world in passing are still in our hands. Alexander conquered the world in 13 years, and his empire did not survive him by a single night. Seleucus spent 40 years building, and pieces of what he built are still running quietly under the floor of the modern world. Perhaps that is the real answer to the dying king's riddle. The strongest was never a man at all. Somewhere in Babylon, on a clay tablet, an astronomer once wrote down the number of the year, counting from a night when 1,000 riders came out of the desert and a city decided to open its gates. The count never stopped. It is running still,